Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. If you're a regular listener here, you'll know that we've been exploring the future of journalism and news on the pod these last number of weeks. We've had a couple of fantastic panels. The first was Elly, Alboim, and Bill Fox, who we're referring to around here as the Interns, gave us the theoretical underpinnings of what's going on. The second was just 2 weeks ago with Paul Wells, Joyce, Napier, and Andrew Coyne, giants of the legacy media, talking about the state of that institution and where that is going. So today we're completing the set. We've gathered a third panel, Jesse Brown, Justin Ling, and Michael Spitale, because I want to specifically explore the new media landscape, what it is exactly, what it can do, what gaps it fills, and the power it wields that traditional media no longer does. Jesse Brown is a well-known Canadian journalist, media personality, and new media entrepreneur. Among a long list of accomplishments, in 2013, he founded the Canadaland podcast, grew it into a full-fledged media company, and one of the most popular podcasts in the country. Justin Ling is an award-winning freelance investigative journalist who specializes in privacy and security issues, foreign policy, politics, law, media, and where all those things intersect. His Substack is Bug-Eyed and Shameless, dispatches from the fringes of the information war. I got to know Michael Spitale working for Premier Wynne in 2013. He became the youngest ever president of the Ontario Liberal Party. He's currently the public affairs director for a well-known labor union, but he's here today because he's a co-founder of Air Quotes Media and one of the creators of the Herle Burly and the Curse of Politics podcast. Justin, Jesse, Michael, thanks for joining us here on the Herle Burly. It's going to be a great conversation. Where do I find you all today? Jesse, where are you?
At the Canadaland studio here in downtown Toronto.
Are you a Torontonian, bred and born?
Yeah. I spent about a decade in Montreal, but somehow found myself back here.
Okay, you left Montreal for here, eh? There's got to be a backstory to that.
It's a hell of a city. I thought I'd live there forever, but I figured out that you probably should learn French if you want to stick around.
Yes, yeah, it's advisable, although not essential. Justin. Yeah. Where are you today? Ottawa?
I'm in Montreal, having fled Toronto some years ago.
Yeah. Okay. And Michael, you're here in Toronto?
I'm here in Toronto, David, and at Air Quotes Media Worldwide Headquarters. Right.
There you go. You have a headless body behind you.
I do, and it means a lot to me, and I'll just leave it there, but it's a wonderful painting from a family member.
All right. I'd like to start by just giving all of the listeners a sense of what you're all doing in the fields of journalism right now. So I gave a little introduction, but that doesn't really scratch the surface. So Jesse, what's going on at Canadaland? What is it, and what are you building there?
So we are, I think, the first and the biggest independent podcast network in Canada. There are 20 of us here doing a series of podcasts all focused on Canadian news, politics, media. We've got the Backbench Politics podcast. We've got Commons, which does documentaries on sort of the secret side of Canada, from our monopolies to dynasties to the dark side of hockey. And we've got our flagship Canadaland podcast, which began, and when this began 10 years ago, it was my podcast about the media and media criticism. But we now employ journalists, freelancers, correspondents from across the country. Our new editor-in-chief, Karen Pugliese, just took the reins of our newsroom. So we're a people-powered, listener-supported. We've got over 10,000 paying subscribers, and we're reaching, I think at this point, like 500,000 downloads a month, and we're making a go of it in Canadian news.
Do you have an idea, just to be clear, do you have an idea of the 500,000, how many are unique? So are you reaching 500,000 people, or are you reaching 200,000 people?
It's less than 500,000. Podcast analytics are notoriously difficult, which is actually kind of a bit of a feature and not a bug. We don't have very good spyware in podcasts. People download a podcast, it shows up as a download. So definitely there are people who are listening to multiple Canadaland podcasts every month. Definitely a lot of the people who listen to one of our shows listen to other shows, but we're increasingly differentiating. So people who listen to Mateo Roach on the Backbench don't necessarily like me on my chat show talking about what's in the news every Thursday, and people who listen to our show about Doug Ford, Wag the Doug, don't necessarily listen to Commons, but a lot of them do. So short answer is I don't exactly know.
Yeah. I do remember when you started out focused on the media, because I used to hang around the CBC a lot, and it was quite a while before I heard your name without the word fucking attached to it.
That can mean so many things, but I know the context in which you probably heard it.
All right, Justin, what are you out there doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I've spent my career, I think, doing honestly every job you can imaginably do as a journalist. You know, I started in community radio. I've done news startups, local news, online, newspaper, magazine, podcasting, TV, docs. I've done like basically most of the jobs available for a journalist in this country. Right now, I have spent the last 6 months working for a think tank, actually working for the Public Policy Forum, trying to write a report about the state of polarization in Canada. So you kind of yet another sort of pivot. I'm writing the Substack that's going relatively well, all things considered. I'm still freelancing for the Globe and Mail, for Foreign Policy, for Wired magazine, a bunch of other places. And I'm sort of magpieing it, right? I'm kind of going around collecting little bits of work from every kind of corner of the industry that you possibly can. It keeps me interested and engaged. It helps pay my bills. But I'm also kind of think maybe on the cutting edge of a media kind of catastrophe, right? Like I'm kind of experiencing firsthand declining budgets, pivots, and then abandonments to various forms of media. I spent 4-ish years working at Vice, which is now almost entirely bankrupt. I spent a year on contract with BuzzFeed News, which is now dead. So I've like a little cockroach that has survived the nuclear explosion to some degree, and doing well right now, but who knows what 3 years from now looks like.
Well, without revealing too much, I don't need to know whether you drive a Bentley or a Kia, but what is the Justin Ling business model?
Yeah, I mean, the business model is spread risk, right? If one of your clients goes under, make sure that you have 2 to replace it, and that you have 4 other people sending you checks any given month. Substack, my Substack is direct money directly to me. I have a modest 6,000 subscribers, which is pretty good for sort of a niche Substack that I do once a week. And a good chunk of them pay me money, which is swell. I take these contracts. I've been doing reporting for the National at CBC, and CBC pays pretty good money, and it doesn't look like they're going anywhere, at least until the next federal election. So the business model
that's the long term in the journalism world now.
Yeah, exactly. So the business model is have as many clients as you possibly can, build up a dedicated roster of followers and subscribers who are happy to pay you money directly because they know the money is going directly to journalism, and also develop so many kind of transferable skills that you can pivot and do something else if one thing sort of falls apart, or when the pivot to video ends, make sure you're ready for the pivot to podcasting.
Right. Michael, what's air quotes?
What is air quotes? That's a good question. I think, our group, there's 5 of us, for all the listeners out there, there's 5 of us that are air quotes. Yourself, Jody Calero, David Rosenberg, Jill Engelman. And I think for us, air quotes started as a bit of a passion project. It was something to feed our political appetite, something to fill a void in the marketplace of political content for stuff that we would want to hear, we would love to hear. And it's continued that way for some number of years now. I don't think we're in the business of news. I think we are really curious citizens who want to make really good content for listeners. And we start there. And we start with a core premise of who are the most important audience to us. And it's people that we've worked with. It's people in government. It's people in politics. It's people who've run campaigns. It's people in news and journalism. But I don't think we're news. I think we're very different than that. And we all have day jobs. So I think really air quotes is a passion project that fills a void. We have a tagline that we use on the end of our content, politics from the inside out. I think we use that as a North Star to make sure that we continue to bring people stuff that they would want to hear in the political business. And so I think that is a big differentiator between what Air Quotes Media does and what so many other people do in news and journalism. And really, I think we're fans first, we're consumers first, we're citizens first, but we're not news and journalism.
What gap, when you had this idea, what gap were you looking to fill? What do you think wasn't being done that needed to get done by the existing journalism ecosystem?
For me, I'm a podcast junkie. I've been listening to podcasts since they launched on Apple, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years ago, whatever it was. I was a university student and I didn't have cable and I wanted to watch Meet the Press, and Meet the Press was on Apple Podcasts. And so I've been listening to it on podcasts since then. And so I think the thing that is the thing that started for us was there's a guy, his name's David Herle. He's super curious. He's really interested in having conversations with people that he doesn't agree with and some that he does agree with. And for me, there was a podcast that I loved, The Axe Files, hosted by a fellow Politico, David Axelrod. And that podcast didn't exist in Canada from my point of view as a consumer. So we all came together and David Rosenberg came up with the name, the Herle Burly, and we put a brand on it and we've been working on it ever since. But to me, that was the void that we were filling was, is there a Politico that could have really long conversations with interesting people, maybe people he doesn't agree with. And I think we've been doing that ever since. And one of the reasons why it's working is because we've stuck to that long form conversation where there's no talking points allowed. And if you want to bring your talking points, then, there's shows for that. But you're such a skilled host that even for the most clammed up of guests, you can bring out some truth in them. And maybe that truth is embarrassing for them, but, you still do it that way.
Jesse, thanks for that, Michael. I have to say, Jesse, you obviously started out, your niche was media. And so that's probably something that legacy media wasn't doing very well. You've expanded beyond media. So what gap do you think you're filling? And is it something legacy media used to do or something that was never done before?
I think it's we're sort of like growing to fill those gaps. It's interesting to hear Michael tell that story, and it's a similar origin story for us where 11 years ago, I was working, a career much similar to what Justin described, where just like a jobber for 15 years as a freelancer, just doing whatever work I could get in various mediums in Canadian media. But consuming things like I liked everything from Gawker, which was doing, snarky, but often like scoops about taking shots at the establishment media players. But then you'd have like David Carr, legendary media columnist in the New York Times, and a bit more of a traditional approach with On the Media, and then satire, like at the time Jon Stewart taking the piss out of cable news. There was all of this talk about media in the American media, and there was no talk looking at ourselves in Canada. And as somebody who worked within it, I knew that it was really fucked up. I mean, everything from the way in which like it was just sort of okay that there was this plagiarist as a star columnist for the Globe and Mail. It was just kind of like accepted that was something that could happen here, to all the murmurings about Gian Ganeshi and a dozen other things. I didn't know the half of it at the time, but there was certainly a lot to talk about. So Canadaland was born from a sense of like, somebody needs to talk about this stuff. Why can't we have this here if they can have that there? And then like somehow the act of complaining about Canadian media increasingly led to people being like, well, if you're going to complain about the lack of, diversity in Canadian media, why don't you do something about it? If you're going to complain about Indigenous news coverage and the tropes that are used and how poor it is, why don't you do a better show? And if you're going to complain about political coverage and how it's very talking points focused, and it's like we're having these interested players from within party politics just spouting off partisan rhetoric, why don't you do something about it? And so that's been the challenge over the years. And where we're at now is a really interesting crux, because to continue to just define ourselves in opposition or in contrast to legacy media, like it's on its last breaths. Like the media criticism side of it, like can sometimes feel like just kicking the corpse of a dead animal again and again. And we're kind of daring to think of this differently for the first time, which is I think that we are among a very small handful of companies that are giving like a rebirth to building a new media that is sustainable and profitable, kind of from the ground up. So we're asking ourselves like very basic questions of like, how can we bring more people into this fold, and what do people really want? And we're getting to an essential level of like getting away from this rhetoric of like, you know, democracy needs us for its very survival, and people are idiots who won't pay for this. And how can we find some, like alternate source of, unrelated revenue from, a gambling site or a coffee subscription service or a government subsidy, but instead actually asking like, what's going to get people? I believe that people wake up every morning and they want to know what's going on, and some percentage of those people will pay to hear about what's going on if they find the information of value, and the experience of hearing it is of value to them. So we're just asking ourselves what is going to turn on that light for more and more people, because we've built a thing that seems to like, every 100 people who listen to one of our podcasts, we can eventually get 10 of them to pay for it.
We've been reading about this news and seeing it, smelling it, breathing it in all summer long. 10 million hectares of our Canadian forests have burned in 2023. Even more sobering, that's a real-time statistic as wildfires continue to rage across the country. What's clear is that we are living through yesterday, today, and tomorrow a present and growing environmental emergency. One that results in biodiversity loss, health issues resulting from poor air quality, and massive CO2 emissions that further drive climate change. Not to mention the economic impact. Annual fire protection costs are more than $1 billion a year. So here's a corresponding real-time investment TELUS's Pollinator Fund for Good announced just 4 days ago. Recall that Pollinator is TELUS's $100 million social impact fund, investing in startup companies where making the world a better place is baked into the business model. Dryad Networks is a German startup who've developed wireless interlinked gas sensors that, in combination with large-scale Internet of Things networks, detect wildfires in their earliest smoldering phase. As soon as trace amounts of gas are detected, the system sends alerts across the network within minutes, so first responders can get to the nascent fire before it spirals out of control. With the amount of forest burned by wildfire projected to double by 2050, TELUS's investment is going to dramatically accelerate the deployment of Dryad's technology. Right now, it's in Europe, South America, and parts of the US. Pollinator will help it scale further in the US and into Canada. The goal by 2030? 120 million of these sensors will protect 4 million hectares of forest around the world. Herle Burly-ites, it's always good to make a timely investment. But after what we've seen this and the last few summers, this one couldn't be more critical. Go to telus.com/pollinator to learn more. Okay, so is anybody going to disagree with Jesse, or do I have to?
On the optimism, because I have a heaps of pessimism, if that's what you're looking for.
Well, on the whole, here's my issue. Right. First of all, I am scared about the demise of legacy media. Maybe I shouldn't be, but I am. I'm old. I'm scared about all kinds of change now. But I disagree. Like you are articulating, Jesse, you've been very public against the government subsidy to media, and you have articulated that you think that people will pay for news if we make it interesting to them. And it's very similar to what Andrew Coyne was saying to me a couple of weeks ago on the show, and I disagree with it. What does it mean to make news interesting to people? Most people aren't interested in news, never paid for it. They might have bought a newspaper, but they probably bought it for the classifieds and the sports and the obituaries and a whole bunch of other things, and there happened to be news there. But at least everybody was getting some news. It was laying around the house with the front page open there. And So I don't think people will pay for it, and I think they need it, and I don't know what it means to make it more interesting.
Well, here, let me have a go at this, because I think the reality is there's a whole bunch of outlets out there that are doing a really good job at making news, or at least news adjacent content / commentary interesting, right? We get really fixated in these conversations of, what's happening to the newspapers. What is the Times doing? What is the Globe doing? The reality is a ton of people are getting their news every day from Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and some other sources. And we love to poo-poo that and pretend like that's not real or that's not news. The fact is, a lot of it's very, genuine. Some of it's quite good. People are watching hour and a half long documentaries on YouTube that are rife with sources that are incredibly well done, that are often done by teams of 2 or 3 or 4 people, that is replicating what used to be on the Passionate Eye or the Fifth Estate or whatever. So the reality is people are actually still getting their news places, and they're finding it from creative and innovative and disruptive sources. And I actually would go so far as to say that people are probably getting orders of magnitude more news, that is general content about, the world at large, today than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? But, what does that actually mean in terms of the kind of professional journalism class? Really, really bad things, because we're not producing the things that they're watching. And if we are, we're not able to monetize it, right? Sometimes those documentaries are using the work we do, or, the TikToks or whatever, using the work we do to undergird their sort of documentary, their reporting, their content. But people are not accessing our work oftentimes directly. So, this is a much deeper problem about distribution, right? We always talk about revenue as the issue, right? Advertising went away. People are getting the newspapers delivered to their home every morning, but we don't talk enough about the distribution problem. The reality is the internet has fundamentally broken the way in which we give people news and information, and we haven't figured out an effective way to repair that distribution model. We thought it would be social media. We got really burned on that, right? We hoped it would be podcasts, but it does seem like there might be a ceiling to how much podcasting people want to listen to every day. We hoped that people would download our apps. They're not downloading our apps. We hope that the tablet would revive the industry. And I'm sorry, Andrew Coyne, people are not going to buy tablets. We've already perfected the technology. People do not want them, with the exception of Quebec. La Presse did a really good job with La Presse Plus, but people are not going to read the Toronto Star on a tablet in the future. It's not happening. So, what is the solution for this? I don't know. Nobody seems to know. And this is, I think, one of the fundamental problems of the industry. We have not figured out how to bridge that divide between news producers and news consumers. And yes, we can do it in more interesting and clever ways, but those interesting and clever ways don't seem to be monetizable. So we are in a really tough spot, and I don't think we have a solution for it. I don't think the solution is immediately apparent.
But I'm sitting right here. We've solved it.
Well,
listen, most of what Justin said is correct, and everything David said is wrong. So most of what Justin said is correct. So first of all, let's just do away with some ridiculous notions that have somehow become commonplace. The idea that journalism exists in some category that is apart from what is interesting, and that it's something that's good for you and necessary, but no one will pay for it, and it's and to talk about making it interesting is somehow profane. That is such a journalism with a capital J, Pulitzer Prize winning, this journalism on a pedestal is an outgrowth of a popular press that figured out how to monetize information, a popular press that always mixed hard news with just what's going on today with a bunch of bullshit. And out of that came, for a brief period of time, very self-serious journalists who would never sully themselves with these ideas of keeping people interested. We need to abolish that concept whatsoever. We also need to abolish the concept of the most people fallacy. Okay, most people won't eat a vegan burger. There's still a vegan burger shop on every few blocks of a major city. Yes, we do not have a service or a product that is going to be of interest to most people. And we got to get used to that. We're never going to reach the scale that we had in the previous century. We are offering a niche product / service. So we do need to focus on the people who are willing to pay for it. We need to start thinking much more intelligently about the differentiation between those who will pay for it and those who will consume it but won't pay for it. It's interesting to hear Justin talk about distribution as a problem. The internet was incredible for news distribution. It was made, like, first of all, you can report news instantly. You can get news to more people than ever gave a shit about news before. And we are in a golden age of news distribution. Like, it's immediate. You don't have to have a satellite truck it's incredible the amount of news that can spread instantaneously. So really there's just like, and when we talk about we have a problem, it's a financialization, monetization problem. And the we is kind of like, well, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the old newspapers? They don't even recognize they have that problem. Like because they're most of them, especially in Canada, are so tripped up with just trying to hang on to some mode of survival that they're not engaging in earnest with a very real question. That's what they should be engaging with is, hey, all of these people on TikTok and all these creators are taking our reporting and reformatting it into really interesting packages that people want to consume. How do we do that and not leave that for somebody else to do? That is not a question that most of our legacy news is engaged with because they're too busy lobbying for some sort of savior, from the federal government.
That's a dumb summary. Of course, all of these outlets are trying to be popular on TikTok. I mean, Global News, Rachel Gilmore was.
Didn't the Star just get rid of Evie Kwong? Like they had somebody who was succeeding in that, and then they laid them off. Like they're not really trying. They're not making a go of it and trying to find a place for themselves in the new media.
Their legacy distribution model is still earning them millions of dollars a year. How much resources do you put in TikTok? A format that earns you, at best, if you get monetized, a couple $1,000 bucks.
I don't think that I don't think that those ships can be turned around, and I'm not going to argue that if they just crack TikTok, I actually think we need to get over this. Like, how can we save the? I think there's some incredible journalism.
That's a big thing, Jesse. Like that's a big thing just to blow off scale, because we spent a lot of time with Coyne and Wells and Napier talking about the comments. What does the broad mass of the public know? As opposed to what does a small group of elite informed people know? What does the broad mass of the people know? Justin deals in disinformation all the time. I'd be interested in his perspective on uninformation. But on the comments thing, we're getting so atomized. Like I think about it like music. So back before you were born, Michael, when I was a kid, everybody listened to Top 40 radio. You had to hear Top 40 radio. You couldn't avoid it. So whether you were a Yes fan or a Zeppelin fan or a Carpenters fan, everybody heard You Light Up My Life by Debbie Boone. And now there are massive hits that most people have never heard of because you listen to what you listen to and it's all isolated. That's one thing in music, but we're talking about the core base of a democracy here in terms of information. As you see this legacy media thing disappearing and you look at the new media landscape emerging, what do you think?
I share your fears, to be honest with you. I think that Jesse is right and Justin is right and your fears are right. But, we have a technology reality that has changed things, like it or not. When the New York Times existed 100 years before the evening news existed. And then all of a sudden that changed things. And the way we began to consume information changed. And then the internet came around in the 90s. And all of a sudden, people could get information online. And then 2007 came around and there's an iPhone. So everybody could make an app. And on that app, you could have podcasts and radio and print and everything. And I don't think it was until around 2011 that the New York Times finally put their app on a paywall. And in that time, from 2011, 2012 to today, the New York Times has found a tremendous amount of success. There can only be a couple New York Times, or there can be only be a couple Washington Posts. The business of news is dismal, said the vice chair of Bell Media. The economics of news are dismal. He's probably right. And I wrote this down just because I was thinking about this conversation today, David. So I'm just going to read it because easier for me that way. The classified ads and the stock market quotes are the bedrock of the press. Should an alternative source of easy access to such diverse daily information be found, the press will fold. Marshall McLuhan in 1964 said this. This was 60 years ago, before the internet. This guy told us what held up the press. And now we have tons of media for people to go after. The number one podcast in the world is Joe Rogan's. The number one news podcast, if you want to put things into certain categories and exclude him, is the New York Times. But also on that list of the top news podcasts are Russell Brand, Ben Shapiro, Dan Bojingo, Candace Owens, and Megyn Kelly. Now, you might hear that and make it sound, or I might make it sound like these people are not the news. But they are not the news. They are where people are going to get informed at length for long periods of time, just like I did in the early 2000s with Jon Stewart. And in 2008 or whatever it was, Time Magazine's most trusted person in news was not Brian Williams, it was Jon Stewart. So like there are things that our technology is doing to our media that are never going to allow us to go back to 1964 or when the New York Times was print only or when everything was subscription based. So I think the question that you're really asking is news a public utility? Is it so important that everybody should have access to it? And if that is the case, I know, Jesse, you're bowing your head, and fair enough. But I do believe that we don't have shared information. I do believe that. And so if subscriptions aren't working because people aren't willing to pay for them, and advertising isn't working because there's so many places for advertisers to run their sponsorships, then maybe there is a Ottawa Bureau Gallery that is subsidized by taxpayers, even though not everybody is reading it. The public subsidizes elections. In the Scarborough Guildwood in Ontario last week, there was 21% turnout. And yet we all paid for it because it was a public utility. Maybe there's some version of actual journalists, not air quotes media, not the Herle Burly, not Curse of Politics, but actual journalists who are reporting on their governments that ought to be a public utility where people like Justin, who's doing investigative journalism, are compensated for that work. And it's free to the commons. I don't know what the actual model looks like, but maybe that is a model so that everybody can get information that is shared as opposed to, RFK Jr. going on Joe Rogan podcast and the Bill Maher podcast and the Russell Brand podcast and all of these podcasts that have way bigger reach than the evening news. So whether that's news or not, it's certainly information and people are being informed by it.
Not that most people were paying much attention, this being July, but as of last week, Canada has a slew of new federal cabinet ministers. How interesting that fact is to you probably depends on whether you inhabit Ottawa's ecosystem. As the Wednesday shuffle drew near, the chattering class practically consumed itself, trading in gossip and snark and schadenfreude. But out there in the land, some of those cabinet appointments are as serious gets. Government oversees and regulates vast swaths of the economy. Having the right people at the top of the pyramid is literally crucial to our well-being. An example? Transport Canada. It's a vast ministry, both a regulator and dispenser of government funding. It regulates rail, air travel, trucking, and marine transport, to name just 4 vital sectors. It's no exaggeration to say that every one of Canada's 338 federal ridings has some sort of transportation issue. And these are tentative, fragile times. Our supply chains, which ensure our quality of life, have endured an unprecedented level of simultaneous attacks, severe weather events, foreign wars, the aftermath of a pandemic, labor disruptions, and manufacturing problems, to name several. Ensuring Canada's supply chains remain fluid and resilient, ensuring throughput, to use an industry term, is a massive task involving a long list of players, including our sponsor CN. But it's Transport Canada, and ultimately the minister, who carries the stupendous responsibility of enabling it all. That's the system. A skilled minister makes all the difference. So all of that is to say, welcome, Minister Pablo Rodriguez. Your reputation precedes you. To paraphrase a popular song, an economy turns its lonely eyes to you. CN looks forward to an enriching, collaborative relationship with emphasis on collaborative. And now there's work to be done.
I'm trying to find a polite way to respond to everything. It's first of all, like, Justin does investigative journalism, and he does this, and he does punditry and analysis, and you're creating these categories that have never really existed. You're also just, and you're not the only one doing it. There is this massive movement to try to create some sort of publicly funded public utility journalism that ignores the crucial centrality of independence, as if this is some sort of outmoded idea, or that you could somehow circle the square of having the government pay for a tiny elite class of everyone else is communicating every day. They're doing a mix of analysis, opinion, and reporting. Everyone's reporting, but we're going to anoint through taxpayer dollars some press corps or gallery of this is the real information, and everyone's going to pay for it, and we don't care if anybody consumes it. And this defeatist kind of Eeyore notion that we've tried nothing. We've tried nothing.
I am Eeyore. I'll take that. I'm definitely Eeyore. That's not an insult to me. That's a mirror.
And then this kind of looking down our nose, look, I think that the only problem with Joe Rogan is that he's so popular. Okay, when it was just another podcast among literally millions of podcasts, it's wonderful that there are all kinds of people, smart people, dumb people, and for every idiotic thing or bit of poorly informed information, it's still a show in which people are having conversations and discussing what's going on in the world. The problem with that show is it became tremendously influential. You say in passing, oh, and one of them is The Daily. It's incredible that The Daily is as popular as it is. That is basically the New York Times best story for a half hour. 20 minutes to a half hour of high level reporting. And it's one of the most popular podcasts in the world. Podcasting is an incredible sign of hope in this conversation, that we can't just sort of podcasting, maybe there's a limit to. This isn't in an age when attention spans are shorter than ever. Information's getting down from 2 minutes to 30 seconds to 3 seconds. Here is a medium where people are willing to spend 20 minutes to an hour or more listening to humans talk. The amount of information you can convey in a podcast, and the audience for it, 25% of people now get their information from podcasts, which is not, we could try to put that in the profane category of shitty internet misinformation, but it's not, it doesn't really wash. You can't really put, even those rogues gallery of your Ben Shapiro's and the Joe Rogan, they don't really belong in misinformation trash. They're problematic, and they are definitely speaking to echo chambers, and they get things wrong, but it's still
the other week Joe Rogan and RFK Jr. The other week RFK Jr. and Joe Rogan sat on the show and explained that HIV doesn't actually cause AIDS, and in fact that it's gay men's degenerate lifestyle that causes AIDS. So
but they
are absolutely vectors of misinformation.
What we're seeing is the same process that played out with the penny press and the yellow press, where the bigger it gets, the more important it gets that it get responsible. Okay, so there's increased pressure on Joe Rogan, you can't do this shit anymore. And so
what pressure? The only pressure is to keep doing what he's doing, because that's what works. Spotify partnered with him not to wag their finger and say, hey, you better get serious about reporting the news. Spotify partnered with him and said, keep doing what you're doing, Joe. You've found the magic sauce, right?
Well, didn't they remove a lot of his archives and start to actually deal with?
Then they put it back up with stupid little warnings in the description that meant nothing.
So, Justin, where are you at on this broader conversation, Justin?
Yeah, just deeply, deeply pessimistic. And let me explain why. I love the idea of the comments because, we can admonish them and say they haven't innovated enough and they're stuck in the past. But the reality is, Jesse, all of your shows rely on the reporting of the Globe and Mail and the CBC and all these other outlets, right? Without major outlets doing, staffing huge newsrooms
and the Globe
hiring.
Mail relies on us. Where do they get the We Charity story from? That's how journalism works.
Let's be real.
We have people breaking stories and then building on each other's work. And that's just how it goes. And in the early days, it was much more of a commentary, and then at a certain point, you contribute more original reporting, and that's the circuit of how information builds.
But
that's
you're a newsroom of 10 people, and they're a newsroom of
20.
Oh, sorry, 20. I didn't mean to undercount. You're a newsroom of 20. They're a newsroom of, I think they're still in the hundreds somewhere, right? You were different beasts. They have the resources and the skills and the capacity to do a wide breadth of reporting from across the country in a bunch of different fields, and your smaller newsroom doesn't. And that's fine. This is how this is supposed to work, right? This is what the ecosystem looks like. But the reality is all of the startups that were supposed to come in and replace the big media outlets, they've all failed spectacularly with a couple of tiny exceptions. Some of them have done well, like yours. You found a niche and you found a space in the ecosystem, and you're doing well and you're growing. That's great. A bunch of others have totally failed. Like I said, BuzzFeed News is gone. Huffington Post is gone. Vice News is gone. You see other outlets like Overstory and Passage and The Discourse that have either basically stagnated, gone through layoffs, shrunk, and they have just not managed to turn out the amount of journalism that they promised us they were going to. Now, there are some nice media. There are some nice exceptions. Places like Village Media.
Hold on a second. Let's not whiz past.
This isn't your show, Jesse. Let me get through.
But this is hilarious to me that we can just disappear over 100 Canadian startups. And I agree with you, and I agree with Michael here. We need to get some focus here of what hasn't worked and what does work. And
that's what I'm trying to get to. Let me get to this. Right. Of those 100 outlets, how many news stories are they breaking a week? Right? Like how many? It's not a big number. How many news stories?
More than the legacy media at this point.
But wait, let me jump in here and say, okay, there's breaking stories, and then there's breaking uninteresting stories. So let me give you an example. Chinese electoral interference. Mm-hmm. Apparently, by the polling, nobody in Canada is interested in this story. Right? When pollsters ask Canadians what the most important issues are facing Canada right now, somewhere around 0% will name that issue. And other polling evidence is they're not following it, they don't care about it, they're not interested. It's still important. It's still important that it was reported. It's still important that it's on the record, but it's not interesting.
It is interesting. We just make it boring on purpose. Like Bill Miker, that ex-Mountie, is incredibly interesting. You wouldn't know it from the coverage. If you Google that guy for an hour, you will find out that he's like the only American citizen who a court has ruled can have sex on the job. You'll find out that he went undercover with the Commodities Exchange in Winnipeg and found 85% corruption levels. Like if the Globe and Mail was trying to make this boring, they couldn't do a better job. There's a problem in Canada where we've predetermined that our news is boring, and we report it as such. It is our job to make this stuff engaging. It is our job to engage the public. And no, in a country with an opioid crisis and a housing crisis and inflation, it's going to be hard to get people to care about foreign interference. So we have to be better storytellers. And there are audiences that turn up in droves for American coverage of news stories, because one thing that good podcasting does is it makes these stories interesting and tells them as narratives. And we're failing at this. Legacy media is failing at this. And one of the gaps that we feel is like there's just a wealth of stuff that if you approach it the right way, it is fascinating. And no, not everybody shows up, but enough people show up that we have a business that's growing every year. And to Justin's point, we're not trying to replace. And I think that one of the things we got to get over is the notion that the new models that work are going to replace the old models that are failing. So a bunch of things that are like, it's hilarious to me to hear a Bell executive say, oh, news is a bad business. Bell is in a multi-billion-dollar business of providing internet infrastructure that we can't live without. News is just like a rounding error to them, whether it succeeds or fails. The speculative tech bubble that gave us the Huffington Posts and the money that came into Vice, and that was more about legacy media trying to stay relevant. All of these models are breaking, right? The BuzzFeed model, all of these models that we can replicate an IP Silicon Valley startup and take that into news, all of that is failing. So corporate news is failing. Silicon Valley style news startups are failing. What does succeed is reimagining news on a micro scale. So yes, it is about tiny news operations that are not trying to be the Globe and Mail, that are trying to fill very specific niches. So we have the Halifax Examiner and we have Village Media stepping into local news markets that legacy news have deserted. And we have the Narwhal, and you add it up and you've got yes, over 100 tiny newsrooms. Some of them are like 1 or 2 people that cumulatively, like we're at a place now where you've got Post Media papers that have like 1 reporter doing like they're actually smaller than some of these tiny micro newsrooms. But so that is where the energy is, and that's where the sustainability is.
Okay. Michael, you had something to say earlier?
Yeah, I don't. What I was trying to say earlier, just around Jesse's point of me admonishing podcasts, is not that I'm being critical of the podcasts. I consume them more than anybody that I know. My point.
I think it was a dig at me more than anybody.
I can't even remember.
The thing that I think is among the more important things in this conversation is, does our society have shared trust? Are there voices that we turn to where we can have honest debate about the things that are going on in our society? And is that happening on the scale where we can engage in the same kind of conversation? You used the word earlier, David, I think, the atomization of the media. That is absolutely true. And I think Jesse's right. There is no putting that back in the bottle. And that's what I meant by the New York Times existing for 100 years before television, and then the internet disrupting that, and then podcast disrupting that, and then our devices that we hold in our pockets that have every media that we might ever want to consume in the world disrupting that. That is the reality. But the question of trust is a real one in a democracy. If we don't trust each other, then our democracy, arguably, to go back to what the Washington Post tagline is, democracy dies in darkness. That is a real fear that I think a lot of people have, but probably not enough people have. And so, Jesse, you're right that we have to create the kind of content that are interesting for people. When I was looking back at the history of the CBC, it wasn't created to have a news network of shared commons. It was created for entertainment purposes on the CN rail line, so that when people were taking long trips around the country, there was something for them to be entertained by. And I'm not critical of the Jon Stewarts. I'm not even critical of The View. The View is among the most watched daily news programs. And I say news programs because it is a place where a whole segment of the population turn to for conversations about what is happening in our democracy and our government and our politics. And so my suggestion that there be a public utility for news isn't to fund Post Media. It's not so that they can plug a leaky hole in their bucket to pay some debt holders in New Jersey. It's not that. It's to make sure that people like Justin exist so that investigations on our government are happening, so that there's people that can say, wait a second, you are misusing your power, and voters and citizens need to be informed about that. And I think you do a really great job of that, Jesse, at Canadaland. You guys are really holding people to account for the power that they use or misuse. But I think the thing missed in this atomization is that we don't have shared conversations. As big as Joe Rogan is, and as abhorrent as I think some of the conversations he might have on his podcast, it is real. It is substantive for the people that listen. But it is not a place where people are rolling up their sleeves and doing FOIs and figuring out, does this policy match the rhetoric that you promised voters? That work isn't happening. And so people turn to TikTok and other places. And I'm not really being critical of people, except that people don't want to pay for it. What they want is free entertainment, and hopefully they can get informed by that. I think TikTok now has... the average user spends 24 hours a month on TikTok. And the biggest accounts aren't the Toronto Star, and they're not Justin Ling, and they're not Robert Benzie, and they're not Stephanie Levitz. They are people that do dance videos or people that eat Tide Pods. And that is the content that frankly is entertaining. It is not the content that is giving us shared information by which we can cast our ballots to form our democracy.
Justin.
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, first off, I'm not on TikTok. If I was, I would be the number one. I'm just putting that out there. I would be absolutely the most popular.
Eat a Tide Pod and I'll check it out.
Yeah, I'll deliver the news while eating Tide Pods. Listen, there's actually a ton of really interesting folks on TikTok who do news, who do serious quasi-reporting or explainer videos, and it actually is a great avenue, as our podcast, as are all of these things. But you're 100% right. We need that big thing in the middle that is going to do all of this work. But here's where my pessimism comes in. They are not succeeding, and bailouts and government subsidies aren't fixing the problem either, and they might be making it worse, right? We love talking about the New York Times. David, your last show was everyone kind of doing everything's bad except for the New York Times. The New York Times is not doing nearly as well as we think they are. Yes, their number of subscribers has exploded. They've exceeded expectations, but they padded it massively with people paying $1 a month. And we don't know if those people are going to stick around when $1 jumps to $10 or $20 or whatever. So you look to the other places. The Washington Post is not doing well right now. The Globe and Mail is in doing better than everybody else, but I don't know that their long-term viability is a certainty, right? So these big players are not doing well.
Globe and Mail exists as long as the Thompsons are prepared to underwrite it. That's how long it exists.
That's a big caveat, though, as long as the Thompsons are willing to underwrite it. Do you know when that bill comes due? Because anyway, all to say, we saw a massive newspaper bailout that extended both to the big players and to a ton of small players. Those small players ate that money up and did not grow significantly. The big players ate that money up and used it to give money to their debt holders, right? That money largely went into a black void. Maybe it stemmed some layoffs, but it did not see a rejuvenation in any observable way to media in this country. I don't know that putting good money after bad is going to do much better. Is there a world in which we just stop taxing journalists and give them a $50,000 stipend a year? Would that be significantly better so they can go produce news for free on Twitter or TikTok or whatever? Maybe that's the best thing we could possibly do. But you also get to this point, we talked about revenue being a problem. We talked about distribution being a problem. The third part of the problem is trust. People are losing trust in legacy media. All of the polling data we have suggests as much. Now, I don't think the only problem there is the government giving them money, but I think it's part of the problem. I think a decline in quality is part of the problem. An increase in processed stories and dumb content is part of the problem. I think people getting alternate sources and deciding they want something better, that's part of the decline in trust. But it is a problem, and we're not solving for that either. We're obsessed with the revenue problem. We do not talk about the distribution problem, and we don't really talk about the trust problem because they're just too hard to fix, and we don't know what the fix is.
No, but sticking with the trust issue for just a second, Justin, and you're an investigative reporter. You are a freelancer, and in other years, you might have been in a newsroom with colleagues, with an editor, with a coffee machine, with a steady paycheck, maybe an expense account. I know you'd be more comfortable, but how would that affect your work? Like, how is it better to be a journalist inside an organization than just on your own, running around trying to figure shit out?
I mean, I've had the option. Like, it's not like I haven't had job offers, and I have done the newsroom thing. I've been in the Globe and Mail newsroom. I've been in the CBC newsroom. I've been an editor in the Vice newsroom back when we were, staff. We had over 100 people on staff and a whole complement of journalists. So I've been there. I've done that. I like being on my own more, at least right now. I've also lived through rounds of layoffs, and I don't feel like doing that again. I don't feel like being in an institution in decline. I'd rather be, a growth office of 1 than a shrinking office of 20. So I'm happier doing this, but it's undeniable that there are huge benefits to being part of a well-financed team, right? I do better with an editor. I do better with a copy editor. Absolutely. Anyone who reads my Substack knows that there's occasional copy mistakes in there. I do better when I have a group health plan. I do better when I have legal on retainer, right? Like, all of these things are incredibly important benefits that are the things things that over the years we've built up to make journalism both defensible and readable and enjoyable and profitable. And you don't have that when you're solo, and you don't have that when you're a bureau of one, right? Or two or five. These are the things that comes with scale, and we have not figured out how to scale properly by and large. Now, some places have great, just like I know that Canadaland is in that cohort of ones that have managed to figure this out. But if you want to go start a thing tomorrow and you want to do it with 3 of your friends and break stories in your small town or join the parliamentary press gallery or whatever, the benefits of that scale are not there. And that's really terrifying for some people. It means you can't grow, you can't learn, you can't defend yourself against libel suits. This is a real problem. And we don't talk about that nitty-gritty part of this process. And it's one of the barriers of entry that still exists for many people who want to get in the business.
Look, I don't mean to be just, these are all really important things. I just care about them a lot. And we want to be here for a while, right? Like, Justin and I are like mid-career journalists who, like, it matters to us, the shape of this in 10, 20 years, in a very direct way. I mean, it matters in these like large existential ways, the health of democracy. Mm-hmm. I just want to have like the right conversation about this. I think that in order to kind of define our terms here, like, Michael, I think what you're talking about is like even larger than like, oh, will there be a job for a reporter? What we're talking about is like, will there be a shared objective reality? Like, can we agree on truth? Right. I share your fears about that, but I got to go to work every day, right? What I'm actually trying to solve for every day is, can I make payroll? Can we continue to grow? Can we hire more people? Can we break more stories? Is there a viable model for journalism? So my point here is not, oh, look at me. It's like, I think we figured something out here, and I'd like to see a lot more people doing it. Right. I think Justin, in launching his own, like, what we're learning is the reliance on these platforms, which were so helpful to allow an independent journalist to reach the same scale as an entire news brand via Twitter. The liability of that is that we are standing on somebody else's platform and they might be a maniac, right? Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a move towards podcasting and newsletters where you actually have a direct relationship with your audience. This is an incredible sign of hope. It is crucial. This is like the people who want to hear from you, and then you are engaged in a lifelong pursuit of figuring out how many of them are willing to pay. And I agree with Michael, like, because of that fear of like, am I okay with having a certain safety net of informational security? Yeah, that's why I support the CBC for all of my criticism of them. I think that like we do just want to have some baseline of like,
it's important. They're really important distinction. Thank you, Jesse.
Let's make sure that people are covering the legislature, and there is a central conflict that they are there to keep accountable the same governments that pay their paychecks. That is a problem, but it's a contradiction and a hypocrisy and a tension that I think we can live with, because it's better to have them than not have them. Let's get past that and talk about what comes next. The problem right now, if we're going to have like a conversation about the situation we're in the moment, is that there is not just exceptions to the rule, signs of hope, but there is a model that is working, and it's not just Canadaland. And we have a unionized workplace, and we have health benefits, and we have insurance, errors and omission, libel insurance for our journalists, right? So we've got a model here that has worked for us. I can think of a couple places that it's worked as good or better, and I can think of a few dozen places where it's working in a smaller scale. It's the best. It's the last best hope, is more newsrooms like that. So I think that if we're actually talking about how do we have more fact-based professional journalism, it's like, how do we stimulate and encourage way more of that? I can give you some ideas for that. If we had a 100% tax subsidy for your subscription, where you choose which Substack or podcast to subscribe to, and you get all that money back on your tax return, as opposed to 15%, which nobody gives a damn about, that would make a demonstrable difference in us tripling our subscription level.
That's an idea. That's an idea Bill Fox put forward in his book.
That's right. There's a lot of good ideas out there that are being ignored. If the CBC's journalism was offered on a Creative Commons license, so that we could actually use that and build on it, and every local journalist could take CBC journalism and then say, let's find the local angle, let's ask our local legislator what their, get a quote, build out on that story, that would be the CBC ceasing to be a competitor trying to destroy small news startups by competing for advertising, and actually helping us build these newsrooms. So there are things we could do. Instead, right now, what Bill C-18 is doing, Jeff Elgy, the publisher of Village Media, has announced that his company, which has been moving in, as I say, to these news deserts and building newsrooms, has a hiring freeze. Okay, no one is going to invest $1 in news in Canada while we're like waiting for the regulations, waiting to find out. Like his whole business model relied on Facebook to let local communities, what do local communities do when the newspaper goes out of business? They start a Facebook community news page. And then when he launches a village media site in that community, he goes to that page and buys ads. And he brings that audience from this unregulated, bad kind of untested information environment, and he builds a viable news business. Well, he's getting blocked on Facebook now. Our Instagram is now going down, where we've been building an Instagram audience to kind of promote our stories. People are telling us now, but by the end of the week, we don't expect anybody to be able to get that information. That's what the government interference has done to our model. They have, and if Google follows suit, all our organic search is going to disappear. And when people search for Canadian news, they're going to get the New York Times coverage of Canadian news, as opposed to what our newsroom and dozens others are doing. So, like, we are in a moment right now where the government is endangering. Like, I feel very lucky by accident. Podcasting is somewhat protected from these things. We don't rely on Google or Facebook the way that web-based digital startups do. But this is an existential threat to dozens of small newsrooms that is a completely avoidable self-own, that in this conversation that's been going on for years of, like, how do we fix this? Well, we're actually in a moment where they've imperiled and endangered dozens of viable newsrooms.
Michael, you decided to make. Well, first of all, you go ahead and make your point, but I did have a question for you.
Yeah, go for it.
My question was, you decided to make, air quotes, a sponsor pay rather than a listener pay or user pay system. What's the calculation there?
Because for the large part, I don't think people are willing to pay for news. I think news in some ways, and that's not a blanket statement, largely. If I was wrong, there would be more people paying. And Jesse, I'm not gonna get into your lane on Bill C-18. I don't know anything about it, but I will say this: news was declining before Bill C-18. The economics of news from this Bell executive saying are dismal. That was before C-18. So I think the thing that is difficult in this conversation is what is entertainment that people can hopefully be informed by, and what is actual journalism. I hope people are entertained by, air quotes, media and the content that we produce. But the reason I think it succeeds is because it's honest. These are long form conversations, an hour plus long, and other podcasts do similar conversations, but not many. On TV, you'll have election night on CNN with 14 talking heads trying to squeeze in a 90-second soundbite before they sell ads for bath fitter and Cialis. Like, this is not real news. This is entertainment. And I think people are willing to be entertained, sometimes at a very small cost, but not at the level that will have a news organization fund their newsrooms and allow people benefits and allow people job security so that they know that they can work on a project for 3 months and do the hard work. And then in 3 months have the
but
story.
We do that. And you can do that too. And you would be let me tell you something.
Hold on, Jesse. Let me just finish that. So I think the difficulty is, what are people willing to pay for? And how much time are they willing to spend on different platforms? From the mid 1800s to today, even though technology has changed and the New York Times has changed with it, there's still 24 hours in a day. And so how are we allocating our 24 hours in a day? And increasingly, we're spending them on competing things that are free. YouTube is free for the most part. I got to watch an ad about some great ginger ale that I love to drink. But it's free. TikTok is free. All of these things are free. So I can spend my time doing more things, and people are. And increasingly, I don't have to pay for it as a consumer. I just have to give them my eyeballs as somebody who's being sold something else. And so, yes, advertising and subscription and the way our eyeballs are moving to things has changed, but we still have 24 hours in a day. That's not changing. And where we spend our time is changing. And I think that is a real risk to how we get people to choose to opt in to a system that they frankly don't want to pay for anymore.
Well, I mean, since you asked, I'll give you my advice here. You're a publisher who respects your audience, right? And of that precious 24 hours, you make this show with the expectation and the hope that people will actually give you a significant chunk of that time, and they do. Yeah. And I wouldn't worry about everybody else, right? Those people are giving you their time. And my suspicion is, it seems like you're making a go of it. You've got some top level sponsors that I'd love to have. And if it continues to succeed, my guess is you'll reach a point where you'll say, wow, we're doing well. What more could we do here? What can we do to increase the value of this or the frequency of it if we've got these people tuning in? What if we put a reporter on staff? Or what if we had an offshoot investigative show? And if we started to do that, people like hanging out with us and getting our analysis. But if we were also giving them information they can't get elsewhere, and we make the case to them that this stuff needs to be paid for, I wonder how many of them would be willing to pay for it. And every podcast network in the States that started off as a chat network or an analysis network that has reached a certain level of scale has eventually moved into asking that questions, and they're now trying to build out subscription businesses. Eventually, what you end up with is something that is a small company version of what Justin described a freelance practice is like. You cobble it together from a bunch of sources. You've got your ad money. You've got your subscriber money. We're now doing film and TV shows. We have licensing deals and arrangements like that. Bit by bit, you put together a business. And yes, news does become original reporting. It becomes something of a lost leader. It's hard to fund it directly. It's hard to get people to pay for it to the extent that the year-long investigation, which results in a 10-episode series, those 10 episodes pay for the reporting, but it becomes a crucial plank in the entire structure. This is not just the Jesse Brown solution. There are a growing number of examples of places that have figured this out and are making a go of it. It's like, I don't know what to tell you. It can be done.
But that Jesse, isn't a like you just said it yourself there. The other business is subsidizing the journalism and the news.
But it is, but it's still part of the business. It's still let
me jump in here, because I think I always want to admonish anybody for appealing to nostalgia, right? Because the good old days were not all that much better. You heard Joyce Napier 2 weeks ago talk about the golden age of the 80s. It actually was a great time to be a journalist, but the years that preceded that, you go into the early 20th century, you go into the interwar period, and right after, terrible time to be a journalist. It was full of lies, innuendo, and slander. 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s were pretty good, not the best. But then pretty much any time after that kind of got bad all over again, right? So if we look back to that really kind of idyllic, perfect time, journalism was being funded by ads in papers that people picked up largely to see the TV listings and the classifieds and the sports section. People did read the news, and that was great. But part of the premise of newspapers is that no one really knew what people were reading, right? If you placed an ad in a newspaper and it didn't lead to a bump in business, you went to the newspaper and their advertising section said, well, your ad wasn't good enough. You better make it twice as big next time, right? Advertising in newspapers succeeded because we didn't have analytics. We just lied to people. If you saw a bump in revenue, it was because of the newspaper ad. If you didn't, it's because the ad wasn't big enough, right? So what killed online advertising is that we were actually able to tell advertisers how many people clicked the ad and went and bought a thing. Actually getting to truth was a huge mistake. This is the reason, this and the monopoly that Google managed to force upon us. That's what ultimately killed revenue for newspapers and outlets, right? And now we're at a point where you can tell advertisers, we shouldn't be, but you can tell advertisers how many people skip an ad, right? How many people, just breeze right past. How many people had an ad blocker on? That's the reason we're not getting any money. And Jesse, you're right. Podcasts kind of do better because we're able to, frankly, fudge the numbers a little bit more because you don't get that level of granular analytics. But maybe there's a point where we have to figure out a better way of finding new revenue sources using those analytics as opposed to trying to lie about them. Subscribers are great, but news was never 100% funded by subscribers. It was never thus, right? People are paying for news probably in greater quantities than they ever had in the past, at least directly.
Yes.
So the big question is, how can we augment our revenue, right? We're really trying to soak as many people as possible to paying for this stuff. How do we find other revenue streams? I don't know the answer to that. Government funding is there. It's probably not the best choice. Maybe doing more bespoke ads like a lot of podcasts do. That seems to be working relatively well. Newspapers and magazines
What if
haven't
the government
really tried
just
that
endowed the Canadian press?
That's an option. I mean, frankly, that is one that's been touted around a fair bit, and I think it's probably the best choice. The Canadian press has been hurting for quite some time.
Who owns the Canadian press?
Well, it's a consortium of news outlets, right? But frankly,
winners and losers, right?
I mean, what do you want, though? At a certain point, Jesse, again, I can't keep underscoring enough. Everyone in this ecosystem relies on these legacy guys in the middle. And if they go away, you're going to feel the hurt, too. We're all going to feel that hurt.
Yeah, I'm not cheering for that. I'm not cheering for that. And the newspapers have been providing the bedrock of original reporting that TV news relied on for decades. Everybody relies, it's just that there's less of that original reporting coming from there than ever. I think that there's a
still
mistake
a ton.
Yeah, look, there's something to be afraid of, right? Losing that is going to hurt a lot, and I think it's that fear that has propelled the government into action. That's just going to disappear overnight, and the newspapers have been sounding the alarm and basically saying, like, give us the money now or this is going to happen. We're out of runway. They explicitly said this, but Justin, you made a great point. Like, what are we sacrificing in the bargain? Because the relationship with the public has become so toxic, and people hate our guts. At the moment where we need people to value us, we keep telling them.
You can overstate that too, by the way.
We're both very unlikable people, Justin.
There's not many institutions are trusted the way they used to be in our society. Journalism has survived this thing better than most. And certainly anytime journalists get into a competition with politicians, there's no question about who's more trusted.
That's a low bar. The relation, like I when I see how journalists talk to the public on social media, and I see how, like, first of all, it's like how people, the emails that we all receive, like, I can't believe people, like, why would you spend time with my content and then talk to me this way? And then when you respond and you're like, look, thanks for your note, I don't agree with you, people always back down. They're like, because they didn't think you'd respond. They're just angry at what you were saying, and they thought
Spitale takes pride when we've offended somebody. That's
it.
I'll just say this on the trust thing, because I don't think it's this is a larger societal problem about decline of trust in institutions, whether they be government or news or anything else. But it might have been a month or so ago, Polera released a poll about trust in news. And the only news organization that had a net positive trust of over 50% by both liberals and conservatives was the Weather Network. And I think the Sun chain has an almost negative trust score amongst conservatives. We have a trust problem, and I don't know that atomizing our media is going to contribute to groups of people having shared trust in a same set of information. And, I think the not putting the genie back in the bottle, like, it is not going to happen, but we do have a problem. And
Absolutely.
Can I raise one angle? Because I was really disappointed in myself that I let the last discussion I had on this go by without asking about this, because I forgot about it. But whatever you talk about Bell Globe Media. So CTV has closed all of its foreign bureaus. Pretty much. I think they've got Washington open. Other than that, everything gone. I don't know how many foreign bureaus any of the print organizations have left.
A very small number, not a big number.
Fewer than ever.
Yeah.
One thing new media will not do is that for us. Justin, maybe I could start with you. What is the value to Canada? What are we losing by not having a Canadian trooping around Ukraine with their own eyes on the situation?
Oh, but I don't 100% accept that. To some degree, I will say the agility of a small outlet or a freelancer actually makes it easier to go do that kind of work. I'll give a plug for Tim Mack. He started a Substack called The Counteroffensive. He's Canadian, spent years in the US, and he's now doing incredible, maybe some of the best frontline reporting after being laid off by NPR earlier this year, doing some of the best frontline reporting in Ukraine out there. And he's a small outlet. You've seen a number of of other reporters go and do exactly this kind of work. And there's some Canadian freelancers who are freelancing for Canadian outlets from abroad. Natalie Okoba, my former editor at Vice News, is in Argentina doing exactly that and often contributing to the Globe and Mail. So to some degree, I'm not saying this is a net good thing, but a lot of these freelancers, a lot of these small outlets are allowing us to be a little more flexible than you would be if you were on staff some places. So there is a little bit of bright spot there. I will plug that. But just to go back to this trust thing for 1 second, I think we maybe sometimes don't heap enough blame onto the media for our declining trust, right? We pretend as though it's something in the air that has made people hate at least some of us. But the reality is, to some degree, it's the decline in quality, right? A lot of people are actually wanting good Canadian-focused foreign reporting, and we're giving them less and less of it. A lot of these people are asking for good, thoughtful, in-depth interview shows, and we're giving them more pablum from lobbyists and talking heads, right? We're hearing what they want, and we're giving them the opposite. That is insulting to the viewer and the reader and the listener. That's a problem. But also, we did something incredibly stupid. We followed Facebook's lead in the mid-2010s. Facebook told us that high emotion content promotes more click-through, more engagement, and we followed suit. There's actually a graph you can look up. Again, I'll do this little plug for this report I did for the Public Policy Forum. It comes out August 2nd. Everyone go give it a read. It's really good. I looked at this study that actually graphed the sentiment of newspaper and news headlines over the last 15 years or so. And there is a direct line downwards on newspaper headlines that are hopeful, optimistic, joyful, encouraging, and a direct line upwards of headlines that are angry, pessimistic, conspiratorial, and anxious, right? We started giving people angry content and they got angry in response. What did we think was going to happen, right?
We purposely set people against their neighbors. We purposely set people to hate each other, and then we wonder why they hate us. And then the leopards
ate our face, right?
Yeah.
That's not just the we doing that. As much as I don't want to get into the weeds of Bill C-18, because I mentioned earlier I know nothing about it. Platforms like Facebook are publishers. They're not arbitrarily sitting back and say, David Herle is sharing his information and Michael Spitale is sharing his information and your friends will see it. And if they share it, their friends will see it. That's not how these platforms work. They have decided to boost the very things that you guys are talking about in terms of anger, enragement, and fear, and all of those things. It's not an accident. So they have made it the business model of every other publisher to produce those kinds of content because their algorithm boosts it. If they want to say that they're not publishers, then they should stop their algorithms and just let people see the content that is shared by the people that they're following. They do not do that. And so they have a responsibility in this deterioration of our social fabric because they have an algorithm that I do believe has made them publishers.
I mean, I'll heap as much scorn and blame on them as you want, but I don't really care what they're thinking or they're doing anymore. It was a big mistake to follow them, and we got to worry about our own content, what we're publishing, our own audiences, and seize that relationship back. This conceit of the legislation that they owe this to us because we are ceding to them that they are the public space, for now and evermore. That's a tremendous concession that I'm not willing to make. I'm not willing to commit for perpetuity, and that Google and Facebook are the arbiters of what is true and real. These are private companies that have shown tremendous irresponsibility. I already can see things supplanting them. I'm worrying about my own business. You know what I mean?
How much has it affected trust that all of you have opinions now? So
I think it helps.
Back in the 80s, if I'm reading the Globe and Mail, I know what Jeffrey Simpson thinks about the government. I have no idea what their frontline reporters on the front page think about the government, and they would never tell me in an article or anywhere else.
David,
I have no sense of what their political leanings are. But now they're going to be on the afternoon show opining about Pierre Poilievre.
David, that's part of what's broken, is that people are no longer willing to receive that voice of God, so-called objective, fact-based. People say they want that. I just want news from I don't want to hear what they have. What people actually respond to is when the reporter says, "Look, here's what I learned. Here's what I know for sure, and here's what I think about it." Okay, and that's why a medium where you actually show how the sausage gets made, and what we know that everybody's bringing their own biases and point of view into it, and if you can account for that and talk about that, that's much more effective for rebuilding trust than returning to an age in which we pretend to be news robots.
Yeah, David, you do that on the Herle Burly. Sorry,
go on.
You do that. You have your biases. You have your political leanings. You don't hide them. But you are willing to engage in an honest conversation with people with all sorts of points of view. And you ask people questions that maybe challenge your own assumptions. And viewers can take it for what it's worth, but at least they know you're not hiding anything. I think that is, frankly, the success of Crystal Politics also. It is not just a conversation.
Fair enough, but I'm not Bob Fife. Like, Bob Fife, in his commentary, gives liberals reason to say Bob Fife hates Trudeau. Whereas if he wasn't doing commentary, you wouldn't be able to say that.
Yeah, but I think that's the same as it ever was as well, right? Like you always had Woodward and Bernstein going on TV and saying more or less Nixon's a crook because, by the way, they proved Nixon was a crook, right? Like I think what people get really annoyed by is opinion not backed up by journalism, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, a ton of our television content these days, as well as some of our opinion pages, is full of lobbyists and consultants and ex-politicos, kind of filling the seat of a journalist. Pretend but there's also a place for it sometimes, and there's a place to do it well, and to be clear, you guys do it well. Everyone is, I think, on the same page that you do it well. But frankly, watching some of the panel shows on TV where you oscillate between a real journalist talking about their actual reporting, a government MP, and then a lobbyist, it makes my brain want to leak out my ears, right? Like it's really terrible. I think people actually do like good opinion and analysis if it's well founded, but also there still needs to be a place for maybe it's not voice of God, but at the very least, that kind of neutral, totally objective, I have no thoughts on the matter kind of voice. And I think people do still like it. People still pick up and read the stories in the Canadian press. The Economist is doing better than ever, and you can't get much more voice of God than The Economist. So I think there's still demand for it. But also part of the problem is that we're actually losing some of the jobs that are the best kind of that shoe leather reporting, right? We're losing our cop reporters. We don't have cop reporters anymore. And I don't think we talk enough about how bad that is for society. You still have Gary Dimmick at The Citizen. You still have a couple people. I think Sam Bizzano's just retired, but we're missing those people that do the sort of actual nuts and bolts reporting of what makes a city tick. And it's being replaced by more and more of that kind of reporter analysis, commentary stuff. And people are noticing that gap.
John Oliver made that point on one of his reports, that there's probably always going to be people who cover Washington, but this will be the golden age of corrupt local politicians.
Absolutely.
Yeah, David, I think one of the things that is rubs people the wrong way is when they see an organization that they don't trust getting funding, and that is when that organization, frankly, doesn't have an interest in the news. They have a business interest that is adjacent to the news. But, I am in the camp that maybe public funding for some things is a good idea. We do it for healthcare, and there is pretty high level of trust in how we deliver healthcare. Now, maybe that is in part strained because we don't fund it enough, not because we fund it at all. But maybe there is a model like health teams where you have a physician and a nurse practitioner and a registered practical nurse and a physiotherapist, and all these people coming together to say, we will be your health team.
Let's get journalists out of the equation of journalism, and then we can look. Yeah. One of the chief beneficiaries of funding is on that,
because this model means that Justin can come together with a group of people, or somebody like Justin at a local government, to say, we are going to hold our city council accountable. Here is our news team, and the news team gets funded, not Post Media. And I'm not saying that that is a solution to all of our democratic failures, but it is perhaps a model that we should try out because we're trying out everything else.
Jesse, you got something you wanted to add?
I think that there's like a beautiful dream here that we can depoliticize truth. Okay, depoliticize health coverage. Well, and then fund that wonderful depoliticized coverage. Post Media is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the media subsidies. They had a major investigation of Safe Supply. It was an exorable piece of like factless opinion disguised as journalism by Adam Zivo that purported that there was a new drug crisis in Canada that was as serious as the opioid crisis based on government provided safe supply drugs. It's absolute bullshit. It is not true. And the anecdotal anonymous doctors, for some reason, it was polluting our understanding of this very real crisis, and that was in part paid for by the government. When you force me to pay for bad journalism, when you force me to pay for what I would consider misinformation, my opinion of in the interests of supporting, we need to have fact-based, objective truth so we can make decisions as citizens, and I'm paying for this destructive information, then my trust in journalism as a sector. And when people lose trust in National Post, they don't just say, "Oh, I don't like the National Post or that journalist." They say, "I don't believe the lying media." And our journalists who don't take a dime of government money from media subsidies are painted with the same brush, and people think we're getting money from the Trudeau government. The damage to the sector is immeasurable. I mean, well, to the extent that it's been measured, it's the trust has dropped off a cliff like never before. So I don't know how you do what you're hoping to do. I think it's coming from a good place, but the notion that you really can take these, even when you're talking to the public policy leaders and the public health leaders and the scientists, there are going to be political rifts in each issue, and you can report two very different stories with the same experts.
Yeah. You know what? This has been go ahead, Justin. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. I was just going to really briefly say, I keep saying I don't know what the fix for distribution looks like, but I do start to wonder if that has to be more a part of the conversation about whatever we as a society do, right? Funding is really deeply fraught. Like Jesse is right. Like I like the idea of giving every journalist in the country $100,000 check and saying, "Good luck. Go get her." But yes, you're going to fund bad things. You're going to fund people who do things badly. You're going to fund people who waste the money, who don't spend it efficiently. And you're going to torpedo probably the support for the very program that you need to keep doing kind of indefinitely, right? So that's a really tough problem. But this distribution thing, I think, is really interesting. The atomization of news is fundamentally a distribution problem, right? People have found ways into their preferred outlets. They've subscribed. They've signed up for the email. They're following on YouTube and TikTok and everything else. And they found a way to get a direct supply of The Rebel every morning, or my newsletter, or Canadaland, right? They have figured out distribution there, but those distribution networks are falling apart. Facebook is no longer a major source for news, and also C18 breaks distribution in a major way and will do so permanently. If it actually goes through, it will disincentivize the sharing of news by taxing it, which is a terrible, terrible idea. But even before C18, right? Facebook was absolutely bottoming out in terms of news shareability. Twitter stopped being a significant source of traffic. Reddit, which we don't talk about, but for a time was a source of really smart readership, that's falling apart in a major way for a variety of reasons. Things like YouTube and TikTok don't convert readers. So we actually don't know. Oh, and then Google finally is kind of the last vestige of news readers, but even that is falling apart because it's being crammed with so many ads and sponsored content, right? So we don't know how to get people news anymore. People have already baked into their preferred outlets, and we don't know how to disrupt that. If you want to get people to stop listening to the bullshit on the Joe Rogan Experience, if you want people to plug into Good News and the Globe and Mail and everything else, we need to find a way to get that news to them every morning. We don't know what that is. Can the government solve that? Probably not, but maybe they can help foster the environment in which we can figure out what that is. I hope so anyway. Anyway, subscribe to my newsletter because it's really good.
There you go. Well, on that note,
if I could just add one last thing here, and it's just about what people want. And at the end of the day, people are deciding how do they spend their time. And we are fortunate that people are coming to air quotes media and the Herle Burly and cursive politics and anything that might come next. But what I really think they want not is news. They want this community that they identify with, that they can belong to. And there are so many communities is the challenge, that we have little common ground on which to have conversations with people whom we disagree. And so news has turned into communities as opposed to shared information. And I agree with Justin's Eeyore sentiment that there is no putting the genie back in the bottle.
All right. So let's end on a little bit of a helpful note, because I don't know if any of this has been helpful to anybody. Sure. But let's end on a helpful note. To any of our listeners or viewers who want to add one thing to their daily news consumption, and you can't name one of your own properties, what would you recommend? Michael.
This is a tough one for me because I listen to far too many podcasts, but I'll say there is a great podcast that I enjoy both for the entertainment and from what I learn, and that's Hard Fork by the New York Times. The conversation about AI and tech and business and all of that I find very fascinating. And these are two really curious people that are willing to explore interesting conversations about tech. So Hard Fork, New York Times.
Cool. Justin?
I mean, I'll give a general shout out. I think the Substack kind of ecosystem is really great for finding stuff that you find interesting. There's so many niche communities. But if I'm going to give a shout out to one kind of Canadian outlet, I'll give a shout out to the Logic, arguably the unicorn of Canadian startups that is not just kind of growing steadily but thriving. David Skok and his team do a really, really good job of investigating government policy, the kind of innovator economy, new media and whatnot. And they're the ones who are filing the ATIPs en masse, who are, going to government press conferences, who are covering not just the parliament, but also provincial legislatures. I really can't recommend them enough.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks. Jesse, what do you like out there?
Well, if I'm not allowed to endorse Canadaland's cutting-edge, best-of-class suite of podcasts, and I'm biologically, I can't bring myself to recommend Justin Ling's Bug-Eyed and Shameless.
Understandable.
I guess I'll tell people, you know what? I think it is important to hear opinions that you don't agree with. But, we are in this rage. You want smart opinions. I think that Jen Gerson's doing a good job with Macaroni at the Line, and they're publishing good commentary that I usually disagree with, and that's helpful for getting out of the bubble.
Great, good advice. All right, listen, thank you, the three of you. We went really long today, but it was super interesting, and I wanted to get this all on the record. So I really appreciate the extra time you gave us, and a very, very rich conversation. So. Thank you to everybody who watched or listened today. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. And hope you enjoyed this. Come back next week. We'll have more Herle Burly for you. Till then, take care of yourselves. See you then.